Thank you very much. Members of Phi Beta Kappa and your family and your friends, it's really a privilege to be able to be here to address you today. Having said that, I'm going to diverge for a minute from my little text here because Hazel's introduction reminded me that I was actually inducted in 1963 when I graduated from Columbia College into Phi Beta Kappa, but I had totally forgotten this handshake. So I'm glad you kind of reminded me of it. Also, the dean at that time, not Dean Valentini, but one of his predecessors, told us that we were the best class ever. It is logically possible for each class to be the best class ever, so I suppose that's the way it works now, right? Yes, that's good. And also, I have to apologize for the fact that after my remarks, I have to leave and not see the actual induction because being in New York, and this is one of the great advantages of living here, as you know, I have to go meet my wife to go out to dinner because we're going to the ballet at Lincoln Center, et cetera, et cetera. And given the price of those tickets, we cannot miss the performance. Anyway, as someone who is used to lecturing in blocks, you know the time frame of lectures here very well, blocks of an hour and a quarter, being admonished by Hazel that I must not exceed 20 minutes was a bit of a challenge. But then I reflected that it took Abraham Lincoln only 2 minutes to deliver the Gettysburg Address. Unlike some politicians today, Lincoln understood the value of succinctness. Now, it's customary on occasions like this, and you will hear this yesterday, today, tomorrow, of course, to wish you all well, which I do, of course, and to call on you to pursue your individual ambitions and dreams while helping to improve the world we all live in. But I want to also, especially because you're being inducted into this great society, sort of place on you a responsibility, or maybe a burden as well, which is this: in whatever walk of life you find yourself, whatever you majored in, I urge you to dedicate yourselves to keeping alive the most cherished inheritance of our education here, and that is respect for the life of the mind. Today, that is not an easy task. In the last generation, the values of the market have come to permeate every corner of our society. The notion that the public good may be measured in other than economic terms has been pretty much abandoned. The philosopher William James once wrote that an hour spent communing with nature must be considered, he wrote, a worthless hour of life when measured by the standards of commercial value. The same can be said for an hour contemplating a work of art or reading a novel or a work of history. This outlook helps account for the fact that, as my colleague Andrew Del Banco has written, literature, history, the arts, subjects that do not seem to increase economic productivity, are on their way to becoming stepchildren at every level of education. The study of history, to which I have devoted my professional career, may not contribute much to economic efficiency, but it is an essential attribute of a democratic society. Many years ago, Charles Francis Adams, the president of the American Historical Association, wrote that, quote, "The historical point of view is an important point of view, for only when approached historically can any issue be understood in its manifold relations with a complex civilization." The economical outlook, he added, vital as it unquestionably is, comes much lower in the scale. These observations are as relevant now as they were in 1901 when Adams spoke, because the study of history instills the very qualities so lacking among many of our policymakers and more broadly today: the value of critical inquiry, of subjecting all beliefs to the tests of reason and experience, of questioning dogmas, whether political, religious, or economic, that demand uniformity of thought. Like you, as you heard, I stand at a point of transition in my own career. I've just completed my last class at Columbia and I'm about to ride off into the sunset of retirement. This has led me to reflect on my own experience as a student and a teacher and a scholar, and what lessons we might be able to learn from that history. In my years here at Columbia, I've witnessed many changes. I entered Columbia College in 1959. The college was then a regional institution, all male, virtually all white, almost all students from New York City and the suburbs. It was a far cry from the diverse global institution that it has now become. Although I'm sure many of you would like to revert to the 1959 tuition, which was $800 a year. The finest teacher I have known was actually my father, Jack Foner. He possessed the quality I want to talk about a little bit today, which I call moral courage, by which I mean an independent frame of mind, a willingness to stand up for one's principles, yet also to be receptive to new ideas, and being unafraid to challenge the status quo. My father was deprived of his livelihood during the McCarthy era because of his political beliefs. He could not teach for many years. But he did not retreat into self-pity, nor did he, like many others in that time, save his own career by informing on others. Instead, he made his living by freelance lecturing on current events. Listening to his lectures, I came to appreciate how present concerns can be illuminated by the study of the past, how the depredations of the McCarthy era recalled the days of the Alien and Sedition Acts, how the civil rights movement needed to be viewed in light of the struggles of black and white abolitionists against slavery, and how in the suppression of the Philippine movement for independence at the turn of the 20th century could be found the antecedents of the American involvement in Vietnam. This was history as collective memory and understanding, forging a living link between the past and the present. It was another great teacher, a legendary one here. Some of the parents may remember this name, James P. Shenton, a history professor here for many, many years at Columbia, who inspired me to study the struggle over slavery, the Civil War, and the Reconstruction era that followed. Shenton himself had this quality of moral courage. He was a pacifist who refused to bear arms. He served as a medic during World War II and was among those flown ahead of the lines to enter a concentration camp just after the Nazis had abandoned it. What he saw there led him to try to understand the history of man's inhumanity to man. In the United States, this meant focusing on the role of slavery in our past. Thanks to his teaching, I became part of a generation who came of age in the 1960s and turned to the history of slavery and race in America in an effort to understand the origins of what was happening every day in our streets, when millions of ordinary Americans demanded that the country live up to the professed ideals of our founding documents. I came to be particularly interested in how small groups of courageous people, working for decades to challenge a society whose economic and political system rested in large measure on slavery, how they managed to achieve remarkable social change. These abolitionists certainly exemplified moral courage. In most parts of the North, forgetting about the South, they faced ostracism and sometimes violence when they tried to disseminate their ideas. Nonetheless, in ways we don't fully realize, the world we live in today was shaped by the struggle against slavery. Crucial elements of our conception of ourselves as a nation and as a people derive from the abolitionist movement. The fight for the right to debate slavery openly and without reprisal helped to elevate freedom of speech and of the press to a central place in our own definitions of liberty. At a time when nearly all the states, North as well as South, severely restricted the rights of Black Americans, whether free or slave, abolitionists invented the concept of an American citizenship open to all and grounded in equality before the law beyond the tyranny of race. In researching my most recent book on the Underground Railroad, I came to be more and more impressed by how individuals whose names are mostly lost to history can bring about social change. The efforts of people involved in the Underground Railroad helped thousands of slaves reach freedom in the North and Canada before the Civil War. They were willing to violate federal law, especially the infamous Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, in the name of human rights. Let me mention one such individual of whom I had never heard before I began this research. He had the sort of resonant name Louis Napoleon. He was born in 1800 in New York City to slave parents. Under the state's gradual emancipation law, he became free in the 1820s after serving a long apprenticeship. By the 1840s and 50s, he had become the main point person for the Underground Railroad in New York City. He scoured the docks looking for slaves who had escaped hidden on ships, and he met fugitives who came by train sent up from Philadelphia. Napoleon was illiterate, yet he was able to go to court to get writs of habeas corpus for fugitives who had been apprehended in the city. In one famous case, he obtained the freedom of a group of slaves brought into the state by a Virginia owner in violation of New York state law. At one point in this trial, the lawyer for the Virginian asked sarcastically whether is this Louis Napoleon who brought this case the Emperor of France? John Jay II, the abolitionist lawyer who represented the slaves, and I should add a Columbia graduate, class of 1834, John Jay II answered, no, he's not the Emperor of France, he's a much better man. But my writings have also focused on political leaders and how they respond to social crises. A few years ago, I became one of the innumerable writers who has tried his hand at assessing our greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, and his role in ending slavery. In approaching Lincoln's intellectual and political journey, I came to the conclusion that the essence of his greatness was his capacity for growth. At the time of his death, Lincoln occupied a very different place with regard to these issues of slavery and race than earlier in his life. Lincoln certainly possessed moral courage. He was able to think for himself. He grew up on the Indiana frontier, but from his youth he stood apart from the rough and tumble culture of his peers. He did not drink, he did not hunt, he did not harbor any animus toward Native Americans. He figured out early that the way to get ahead was not via physical labor, but through his mind. He was almost completely self-educated. He had less than 1 year of formal schooling in his entire life, which might make us wonder whether institutions like Columbia are even necessary. But because of that, he was always learning. He did not mind criticism. In fact, Lincoln thrived on it. Today, a politician who changes his mind is castigated as a flip-flopper. Lincoln was a flip-flopper. He understood, as he said in 1862, that in a crisis like the Civil War, the dogmas of the quiet past, he wrote, are inadequate to the stormy present. Lincoln hated slavery, but he was not an abolitionist and never claimed to be one. He was a politician, a lawyer, and a believer in the Constitution and the rule of law. He did not approve of civil disobedience, unlike the people in the Underground Railroad. He wrote in 1855 of fugitive slaves that he hated to see them hunted down, but I bite my lip and keep silent. But on issue after issue, abolition in Washington, D.C., wartime emancipation, enlisting black soldiers in the Union Army, amending the Constitution to abolish slavery, allowing some African Americans to vote. On every one of these issues, Lincoln came to occupy positions that the abolitionists had first staked out. The destruction of slavery during the Civil War is a prime example, as relevant today as in Lincoln's time, of how the combination of an engaged social movement and an enlightened political leader can produce far-reaching social change. Lincoln's most remarkable transition came on this contentious question of race in America. Before the Civil War, while insisting that black people were entitled to the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln certainly shared some of the prejudices of his time. He suggested that once slaves became free, they should emigrate to some other land, to Africa, the West Indies, or Central America. But after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation in the middle of the Civil War, Lincoln abandoned this idea. For the first time, he began to think seriously of the United States as a biracial nation. In his last speech before his assassination, he had proposed that some black men, those who were free before the war and those who served in the Union Army, deserved the right to vote. This was a proposal well in advance of public sentiment then. At that time, only 5 northern states, not including New York, allowed black men to vote. And in his great second inaugural address, while calling for national reconciliation, he also asked the nation to confront unblinkingly the legacy of slavery and its obligation to the former slaves for what he called their 250 years of unpaid toil. Lincoln was raising the question of what would be necessary to enable African Americans to enjoy the pursuit of happiness, which he had always believed was their natural right. This question stood at the heart of the era of post-war Reconstruction, to which I have devoted a large part of my scholarly career. Reconstruction is usually overshadowed in our historical memory by the Civil War, but this is unfortunate because if any era is relevant to the present, it is Reconstruction. Issues that agitate American politics today, access to citizenship and voting rights, the relative powers of the national and state governments, the relationship between political and economic democracy, the proper response to terrorism, such as that perpetuated in the South by the Ku Klux Klan. All these are Reconstruction questions. Unfortunately, Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln as president, lacked all of Lincoln's qualities of greatness. As military governor of Tennessee during the war, Johnson certainly possessed physical courage, but not what I call moral courage. He was stubborn, arrogant, closed-minded, unable to learn from others, and deeply racist. When his own plan of Reconstruction failed abysmally, he refused to rethink his assumptions. Yet a combination of grassroots activism by former slaves and enlightened political leadership, this time from Congress, produced profound changes in our political system. Congress during Reconstruction rewrote the laws and Constitution in what might be called the nation's second founding. The 14th Amendment established the principle of birthright citizenship, that anyone born in the United States, regardless of race, origin, or the status of their parents, is an American citizen, and that these citizens must enjoy equality before the law. The 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote throughout the nation. These measures, one journalist noted at the time, changed a constitution for white men, that's what it was before the Civil War, into a constitution for mankind. In our own time, every session of the Supreme Court has to adjudicate claims to equality stemming from the Reconstruction amendments. Most recently, the claims of gay Americans seeking legal recognition of the right to marry. The idea of equality is an expansive one and keeps extending to groups that weren't really the focus of discussion in the Reconstruction period. Reconstruction also produced our nation's first experiment in interracial democracy, as new governments came to power throughout the South with black and white Americans for the first time in our history voting together and serving in public office. It took moral courage for former slaves to challenge the power of their former owners, and for congressmen facing election every 2 years to seek to transcend the nation's long history of racial inequality. Sometimes, unfortunately, moral courage is not enough. The extension of civil and political rights to black people produced a violent counter-revolution in the South and eventually a retreat in the North from a willingness to enforce the Constitution. One by one, the Reconstruction governments fell. In the next generation, a comprehensive system of racial, political, and economic inequality came into being throughout the South. While violated with impunity, however, the 14th and 15th Amendments remained on the books. Decades later, they would provide the legal basis for the Civil Rights Revolution. But one has only to look at our daily newspapers to realize that the inequalities spawned by 250 years of slavery and another century of segregation continue to bedevil our society. What Charles Francis Adams called the historical point of view does not provide simple lessons for the present. But it seems to me that the era that shaped my career as a scholar can teach us something about today. We should be inspired by the example of those Americans who mobilized to abolish slavery and tried to make the country live up to the creed of equality for all. But as the abolitionist Thomas Wentworth Higginson remarked at the end of the Civil War, revolutions may go backward. History does not move in a straight line of progress. Freedom can expand, but it can also contract. Rights can be won and rights can be taken away. This is happening as we speak today. As was said in the 18th century, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. The greatest threat to our freedoms is complacency, and the greatest defense of our rights is an engaged citizenry. In ways both good and bad, the history 150 years ago is part of our world today. which is why understanding it is essential if we hope to make this a better, more just, more equal society. So thank you all so much for listening, and again, congratulations to everybody here.
Professor Foner, thank you so much.